This is Pastor Chris with the message for July 28th, 2024. I serve the First Cumberland Presbyterian Church in Murfreesboro. We're an open and affirming church. Our mission statement is to be a church without barriers, providing God's love through full inclusion to all people. If that sounds good to you, I hope you'll come and join us, and I trust that you'll find this to be a welcoming group of people. We meet on Sunday mornings at 10:55 at 907 East Main Street. Today's message is based on the book of Leviticus. It's surely one of those things you rarely hear preached, and I'll wager if you have heard the holiness codes of Leviticus preached, you probably didn't hear them this way. My sermon title today is The Holiness Codes. Since I was sick last week, I've had 2 weeks to prepare for this message, and I still think I bit off a bit more than I can comfortably chew. We don't ever talk about stuff like this, at least most churches don't. What's the purpose of the book of Leviticus? Where did it come from? How am I supposed to gain something from this book when it was written about people who lived 3,000 years ago? And then it was written down by people who lived about 1,000 years after the people about whom it was written. And Christians have different ways of looking at their belief systems. In the years before there was a Protestant Reformation, in the West, there was only one church. The Roman Catholic Church had full control over what people should believe, what the text of the Bible meant, and what it meant to live a faithful life as a Christian. And keep in mind that at that time, only a small percentage of people could read at all. Also keep in mind that while the people in most areas of the world spoke different languages, the text of the Bible was read in Latin. Hardly anyone knew what the text actually said. They had to rely on priests and other church officials to tell them what it meant. And this was a problem, but there was at least one potential upside. It depended on a lot of ifs, but if the priests were honest, and if they were well educated, and if they were not forced by the church to tell people things just because they benefited the church, then the people would get an educated understanding of the text and some perspective of how it related to the history of the people. But that's a lot of ifs, and it didn't always work out well. It rarely worked out to the advantage of the regular churchgoer. Then came the Protestant Reformation. Many of the traditions of the church were questioned, and many of them were thrown out. Scripture was translated into different languages so people could read it for themselves and see what was really in there. Most of the things that I've been preaching about for the past few months, my sermon series of things that you've probably never heard preached, had probably never even been heard by the people in the pews. If you have the means to tell people only the good stuff, I imagine most priests wouldn't tell the weird and embarrassing stuff. Now, one motto of the Protestant Reformation was sola scriptura. That means only Scripture. Their goal was to toss out anything in the church that wasn't in Scripture and base everything on Scripture, which elevated the Bible to a higher place in the formation of religion than it had been up to this point. So, now we have the Bible translated into English, and for at least one of us at this church, Spanish, our native language, so we can understand what's in it. And we do try, I believe, to base our lives on this book. But what kind of book is it? Well, it's really not a book at all. It's more apt to describe the Bible as an anthology of many books written over a huge period of time. Think of it as a Hebrew literature anthology, like we might have an anthology of English literature, starting with Beowulf and ending with the novels of Dan Brown, and then waiting 2,000 years to read them. I mean, just imagine how differently people lived in the times when these books were compiled and edited. It's mind-boggling. How can we even hope to understand their mindset? Okay, so we have this anthology of books, included by some people who decided which ones were worth our time and which ones weren't. And somehow they chose to include Song of Solomon and Revelation, and we try to make sense of that. And in fact, we try to build our lives on this. And the Bible is very important. Everyone who is reading these words or seeing what I'm saying today, or who will be here on Sunday morning, is here because we revere the Bible in some way. But none of us takes every verse as just as important as every other verse. None of us weighs the individual sentences in the Bible equally. We don't do that with the individual books. We don't do that with the individual genres of writing. We can't take everything exactly the same because, well, for one, that wouldn't make very much sense to us. And two, we have these brains that are capable of filtering things that are important and things that aren't. And if there was ever a case for what I'm saying here, it is the book of Leviticus. Now, I don't know how many of you have tried a straight-through reading of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. But when I did that when I was younger, I did it a few times, I'd usually get to about the third page of Leviticus and quit. Genesis has all these interesting stories. Exodus is about the journey of the people. And yes, it kind of gets tedious at the end with the instructions about how to build the tabernacle. But all in all, it's pretty entertaining. And then comes Leviticus. The book of Leviticus has a unique purpose. It's intended to teach the Israelites how to be holy. And what the book means by holy is essentially that they will worship only Yahweh. Everything in the book is written with this in mind. Now, the Exodus itself probably took place around 1300 BCE. The most important thing on the minds of the people then was defining themselves as different from the people around them, especially the people who lived in the land they were going to and the people who lived in the land that they had come from, the Egyptians. And then the book was edited by people who had just been through the Babylonian exile about 1,000 years later. That group of folks were trying to make sense of the things that had happened to them, of why it was that the people of God had been defeated, the city of God had been invaded, and the temple of God had been destroyed. So they looked to their founding documents, and they found the places where they had been unfaithful to those rules. And because of that, they believed God abandoned them. Okay, enough about that. But what are these rules? Well, you might have guessed that the title Leviticus relates to the priestly tribe of Israelites. It says what you have to do to be a priest and what the people should do to be good followers of Yahweh. And just guess what the first statute is in the book. Now remember, some say that we're supposed to live by the rules of this book today. And the first command is how a burnt offering should be given. It's about blood sacrifice. It's about who can offer it and what to do with the blood and who gets to eat the meat and when. Now, my first thought is, when I read that, is that maybe not all of this book is going to translate into the modern era. I don't know of any Christians who offer blood sacrifices. There may be some. I'm not going to go start looking for them. I'm going to assume that that command is part of a culture I don't belong to anymore. In fact, I don't know of any Jewish sects who perform these sacrifices anymore. Chapters 1 through 7 are about sacrifices, how to offer them properly, what kind to offer based on what kind of sin you have committed. Chapter 8 tells how a priest can be ordained. Now, we have a type of ordination in the church now. I'm grateful that I've been through it. Our elders have been through it, but it doesn't have to do with splattering blood on the walls of the sanctuary and then on the people being ordained. Dramatic as that would be, I'm grateful. The ordination stuff goes on for 2 more chapters. Now, quick update. Up to now, almost no one follows the precepts of Leviticus. That's the first 9 chapters. No one does this stuff. Chapter 11 starts off with what animals are clean and unclean for eating. This reminds me of a story from a rabbi when I was worshiping at the temple for the High Holy Days. His elementary-aged daughter was at school and got the school lunch. I don't know why this is. It probably merits some investigation, but meat comes in rings at schools. Chicken rings, whatever. Rings. Anyway, she was eating the meat rings, and then she had a horrible thought. So she went to the server and she said, "What kind of meat is this?" And the server said, "Oh, those are pork rings." To which the rabbi's daughter replied, "Oh, I'm sorry, can I have something else? My family is Jewish, and we don't eat pork except in Chinese food." At least this was what he said happened. So how many of us follow the dietary restrictions in Leviticus? Not many. Chapters 12 through 16 have to do with illnesses and remedies for them. They also have to do with rules about cleanliness in the society and when and how you can be considered clean. If you've recently had a baby, or recently had sex, or recently menstruated, everyday stuff. Now, up to now, and we're up to chapter 16, I haven't found many things that people do at all anymore. You'd almost think that the book of Leviticus is a window to another time and one that people in this day and age don't use to dictate their behavior anymore. But wait, there are the holiness codes. Chapter 17 talks more about sacrifices, but it makes the important rule that we aren't to drink the blood of animals we have killed. It says the blood is the life force of an animal, and so drinking it is forbidden. Now before, when we got some rules about sex, we got the idea that bodily fluids were important. Then in chapter 18, we get even more information about sex, more than you probably would ever want. Most of it has to do with not having sex with people you're closely related to, whether by blood or marriage. Interestingly, you're forbidden to have sex with your brother's wife, even if they're divorced, unless he dies, and then you must have sex with her to give her offspring. I'm getting off target. There are all these rules about sex, and many of them are completely understandable. And then there's this line that says, "You shall not sacrifice your children to Molech." And then the one line in the book of Leviticus that so many take with utmost seriousness, "You shall not lie with a man as with a woman, for that is an abomination." All these things about close relatives probably have something to do with other cultures. Now, we know that Egypt, for instance, tried to keep pure blood of their royals by intermarrying. So that sort of makes sense as a definition against the other culture. But then the thing about sacrificing your children to Molech, now that's mentioned other places, but why is it here in this whole thing about sex? What does it have to do with this discussion? Some think that it has to do with a ritual of worship of a foreign god that used child sacrifice, and then that relates it to that next line, that the type of activity that's described there was another type of ritual worship at the altar of a foreign god. Others think the prohibition of man with man has to do with a waste of bodily fluids. Blood and that bodily fluid should not be wasted. After all, for that culture, that was the seed of life. There was no understanding of the genetic material given by women. Some even say that sacrificing children to Molech would be better translated as sacrificing seed. And that could also be a description of the waste of that bodily fluid in a ritual worship situation. The point is, it's a lot more complicated than taking that one phrase out of context and condemning people over it, especially when up to now we pretty much ignore the rules in the entire rest of the book. There are several more chapters. I'm out of time. I would like to point out that there are some other things that are prohibited in the holiness codes, 3 things particular that go together and make one more argument for why the culture had some of its rules. They're tattoos, having clothing that are made of 2 different fibers, and planting 2 types of grain in the same field. These 3 things are all about being confused or not being 100% one thing. For instance, tattoos color part of the skin. Now you might know this. According to the Leviticus codes, if you had leprosy and only part of your skin turned white, you were unclean. But if all of your skin turned white, you'd be considered clean. Now to us that would mean you were sicker, right? But things have to be one way or another. You can't be both at the same time. Yet another point about that man with man. It's confusion. Who's dominant? It's not clear. And so, according to the rules of this culture, that shouldn't happen. It's not 100% one thing or the other. These rules, and many that I haven't had a chance to touch on, are foreign to our culture. Some of them have good uses in our culture, but we shouldn't enforce them because they are in Leviticus. They're in Leviticus for totally different reasons. Almost every rule in Leviticus we already disregard and simply say, it's from a different culture. So why do we grab 2 or 3 out of there and say, that's what we're going to build our faith on? The Bible is so complicated. We already know that we take portions as important and forget other portions. The last thing I'll say is that Leviticus also makes rules about caring for the poor and the disenfranchised, taking care of those with disabilities, treating strangers in the land with hospitality. Now, these are not only in Leviticus, they are to be found throughout the Bible in practically every book. I say, if we're going to build our lives on things that are in the Bible, let's build them on the things that are repeated and then reinforced by Jesus. Loving, caring, binding wounds, granting freedom, offering hospitality. Not the things that get mentioned twice in a book that we widely disregard anyway. That's my 2 cents on the book of Leviticus. God bless, and I hope to see you all soon.